Out there in another world, in a land called Alaron, a deep, rich history presides. Every great society is created off the back of many wars. The turning point for Alaron was what society calls the Great War. The original meaning of the war is seemingly lost after years of fighting. Resources and land were no longer the motivation. Somewhere along the way, it just became a grudge that either side was too stubborn to ignore. Both creatures and people used many weapons, as well as magical spells and barriers through the war. They were so blinded by bloodshed that no one noticed the overuse of spells was polluting the environment. Soil, plant, air, and everything in the surroundings began to absorb this power and morph. Low magic concentration areas resulted in only plants absorbing it, since they are living beings. Battlefields resulted in large pools of magic, which were absorbed by all. Even rocks and wind became magically charged. The magic overdose created some extreme mutations in the environment. Rocks grew to walls, plants became mindless killer drones. Wind no longer followed any climactic rules. Even the water took a dangerous form. These unruly structures formed the labyrinths. Many of these dangerous mazes cropped up all over the land. Some became interconnected, and some dissolved around the edges. At the center of each labyrinth, a magical core was formed from the intense concentration. The cores could take many forms, such as a large glowing rock or a small glistening pond. Each core was so powerful of an energy source, it created a large clearing of neutral terrain, unaffected by the magical pollution. These areas were in a sense the eye of the storm for labyrinths. Surviving friendly beings residing in affected areas gathered in these safe havens and created a new home, while their old one had been deemed too hostile. The overgrowth of these massive and dangerous labyrinths made the war fizzle out due to the realization of what exactly had happened. Another factor was the plants. As plants in lower concentration areas absorbed all the magic power, sentience was born. These mutated herbs banded together to form societies. After enduring aeons of being the bottom of the food chain, despite creating life for all, the plants decided to revolt against all creatures. They began forming armies to torture and consume any beings they might find, just the same way they felt had been dealt upon their ancestors. The war between people and creatures ceased, and a new eternal war began between the beings and the plants. Plants began to evolve in more dangerous ways. They learned of the magic in their bodies and how to create weapons and armor. They only had one goal united, and that was to vanquish all other beings. Poisons became stronger. Vines and roots had much stronger holds. Thorns became sharper than blades. And worst of all, stems and leaves assisted with movement. The beings realized that the overuse of spells is what caused such turmoil. A reduction in magic use was a necessity. However, the plants began to hone their skills and could use offensive spells. Magic must be fought with magic. The solution was to enchant armor and weapons with magical powers and barriers. Armor became bejeweled with beautiful magical barriers. Weapons were formed in a way that could pierce magical armor. Steel and leather were kept around as well in order to have an all-inclusive block and be able to tank any foe. But despite these revelations, the plants still became an intense threat to all other life forms. The retreat began. Homes and entire cities were destroyed. But the societies weren't. Beings grouped together to fight back as they could, but ultimately they saw a losing battle. A few high-flying eyes noticed the mysteriously empty areas within the labyrinths. They further scouted and found these centers to be quite habitable and very isolated from the outside world. No evil plants within. The societies made plans to, together, venture through the hellscape of the labyrinths in order to re-establish a world within these centers. The journey was tough, and numbers diminished, but they noticed that the journey was infinitely tougher for any of the sentient plants which followed. The mindless drone environment and plants within the walls took no sides. Vines would grip anything that moved, even fellow greenery. The beings had excellent ways of fighting off the dreads within the maze, and eventually many citizens made it to the center of many different labyrinths. Resources were plentiful because of the core fueling the external maze. Rocks were chipped from massive, looming walls, only to be regrown within a week from the mutation. It took years to rebuild, but simple villages and cities were erected. The strongest warrior would roam the labyrinth at all hours in order to strike down any foes who managed to get deep enough, as well as lead refugees into the safety of the city. Most were welcome. Unfortunately, just like with any division, no conflict is just black and white. Not all plants became hostile towards the beings, and some beings revolted against their own kind to join forces with the plants. This was the death of the old world and the birth of a new.